Nestor Rodriguez, it's an honor to have him join us because he is what I consider the pioneer in the study of Central American migration to the United States. He published the very first academic article in a U.S. journal documenting this migration. So he has a particular historical lens that he's going to share with us in a moment. Is it ready?
Yeah.
Nestor, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Nestor.
Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. So are we ready to start?
Yes.
Okay. So again, thank you for inviting me to this conference, and I'm sorry that I cannot be there in person, but through electronic means, I'm happy to be part of it. My paper looks at Central American migration in the 1980s when the first large-scale waves began to arrive in the United States and, of course, in Mexico and other regions of Central America. And I want to emphasize the context of the last decade in Latin America, which was a severe economic recession that occurred throughout Latin America and unsettled many populations, many of which began to migrate. The last decade of the 1980s, it's like we can think of it as an economic hell. It was total devastation for many populations, communities, economies. It was the worst economic crisis that many countries in Latin America experienced since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Total regional debt was more than double the GNP of Latin America. Interest rates on loans to Latin America doubled, and Latin American countries could not afford to pay back the loans. Banks terminated credit to troubled countries. Latin American exports and export prices fell, and unemployment shot up. The IMF then began to offer structural adjustment plans for countries that wanted help from the IMF and the World Bank. And we know structural adjustment plans as neoliberalism today, which meant cutting back services provided by governments and extending the economy that operates for profit. So this was the principles of neoliberalism. Also, currencies were devalued and hyperinflation developed in many Latin American countries, including in Central America. So it was a lost decade in terms of economic development that brought a lot of economic restriction, misery to populations in Central America. But it was also the context of civil war. And so you have pressure now from political violence and political turmoil, but also from economic decline, restriction, and crisis. We know that political violence in Central America produced 165,000 Central American refugees in southern Mexico by 1987. So those were the waves of people leaving Guatemala, many indigenous people, but also leaving El Salvador and other violent areas of Central America. But in addition to this refugee migration, there was a parallel migration that emerged of people coming from non-war zone areas in economic decline in Central America. One study by Richard Jones, an early study in 1989, looking at data on Salvadorian migrants who were apprehended by Border Patrol. And when the Border Patrol, even in the 80s, apprehended Central Americans, they asked them what provinces or departments they were coming from. And so the Jones 1989 study found that war zone migrants moved internally and internationally in El Salvador, and non-war zone migrants migrated mainly to the U.S. So this was the parallel migration of migrants forced out of their country because they could not survive because of the lost decade, the severe economic misery. And the primary destinations of the flows coming in from Central America were Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Washington, D.C., and Florida, which are metropolitan areas with large labor markets, and where in some places there were already small numbers of Central Americans living there. And so it was a place to reconnect to communities of origin. It's long been my hypothesis, and I guess an ongoing discussion with a co-author of mine, that Central American migration in the 80s would have occurred even without civil war. That, of course, the Civil War forced many people to leave their countries in Central America to survive. But the economic restrictions of the last decade were so intense that people would have left, in my hypothesis anyway, and in fact, many people did leave because of the economic recession. And to be sure, it's difficult to unravel the effects of civil war and the effects of economic recession, because they affect each other. In Guatemala, where I have done research for years, when the Civil War broke out in the Western Highlands, indigenous areas, even communities that were not part of the Civil War were affected because people were afraid to travel to marketplaces to buy or sell what they made. So the Civil War creates danger and fear. The military's out on the roads and they're recruiting people to fight, and the guerrillas are on the road, and they're also looking at who can support them. So even in places where there's no fighting, no military combat, people are affected because their travel is restricted and they cannot go to marketplaces to buy or sell. The devaluation of national currencies intensified economic restrictions, putting many families at the threshold of economic misery, not able to survive in times of family emergencies. And one example is looking at the devaluation of the Guatemalan quetzal, which is the currency of Guatemala, relative to the US dollar. In 1980, the exchange rate between the quetzal and the US dollar was 1-to-1. And then by 1990, the quetzal was worth only 23 US cents. So that's a devaluation there of about 76 or 77%. I've actually met at least one migrant who told me that he decided to migrate to the US on the day that the exchange rate reached 5-to-1. He told 5 quetzales for $1 US. He told me he knew it was time to go. But also, it's not just economic pressure or political turmoil that's pushing people out of the countries. But in the U.S. in the 1980s, we had the economic age of Reaganomics, where employers began to use more migrant labor from Mexico, but also from Central America, to restructure their businesses, to change their workforces, and hire immigrant labor because they saw it as more advantageous, right? And keep in mind that for most of until 1986 or 1987, it was not illegal for employers to hire undocumented workers. It was illegal to be undocumented, but it was not illegal to hire the undocumented. And so the support for employers came from the Texas Proviso of 1952, a delegation of congressional members from Texas had a law passed in Congress that said that U.S. employers could hire the undocumented, and they should not be considered as harboring or aiding unauthorized workers. Some of the research I have done in the late 1980s, when I started going to Guatemala, was in the Western Highland Department of Totonicapán, and part of my research was to see who were the first migrants from these areas of indigenous communities in the villages. And so what I saw was that the migration began in villages with small landowners who lived just above absolute poverty. They were the most at risk because they had property, but they were only one drought away from losing their land or having to leave because they grew their own food. The second group of migrants that came from villages in Totonicapán that I was studying were craft workers who lived in the town. And so they were also very vulnerable because when economic conditions became severe, they had no market to sell. Nobody had money to buy their products. So this is another category, artesanos, of workers who lived very precariously during the lost decade. And among these early migrants, we're talking about the early 1980s, 81, 82, 83, there were young wives from villages and young single women from the towns who were also among the early migrants to the U.S. Minors, by minors I mean children younger than 18, also migrated, but many for different reasons, and that was to desert the military after they had been forced into the military. So as we know, in regions of Central America, the military just grabbed youth, some as young as 14, 15, 16, and forced them into the army. And in Guatemala, sometimes on Sundays, the military would come in and wait outside the church until the Catholic Mass was over, and then grab kids who were coming out of the church with their families. The destinations for the child migrants were often places where their parents were already working and trying to make a life. One of the characteristics of early patterns that I noticed, and actually later I paid more attention, was that migration creates more migration. People migrated to survive because of the lost decade, severe economic recession in their countries, and then they began to send remittances home. And then families began to use money to buy necessities for the family, to pay for medical services, buy food, et cetera, and this promotes a commodification in the local communities that more and more families are buying things. Some of them that they used to make before, now they buy, sometimes because the people who used to work, for example, in the fields, farming the land that they own, now are gone as migrants, so they have to now hire labor to do the farming, et cetera. And then migrants began to return to visit their communities after they got amnesty and they got green cards. They could travel freely. And so they're bringing back ideas of new commodities, and their children created demand for commodities. So long story short here, migration creates remittances, and remittances then are used to buy things that before may not have been bought. People did without or bought very little. So there is a need for money, for remittances, increases in some households, and this creates more pressure to migrate. And I think it's something that really has not been emphasized as much in the theories of migration. Of course, and there's always been a reaction by the Mexican government to push back Central Americans, and right now we hear about what's going on in Tapachula or southern Mexico, or even in the northern border of Mexico, Mexican National Guards keeping back migrants, et cetera. But there's been a Mexican pushback since in the late 1980s. Mexico began to implement what they call El Plan Sur, and it was U.S. support to finance Mexico's Plan Sur, to provide support, training, et cetera. I know that about a decade ago, President Calderon signed a new law in Mexico to provide transmigrant passes to Central Americans and others crossing Mexico, but that has been withdrawn now, and to discourage Central American migration. U.S. Border Patrol and DHS advisors are in Mexico and Central America, very active, doing intelligence gathering, but also training of border guards and soldiers in Mexico and Central America. The U.S. Southern Command, the military complex in Florida, has been very involved in studying migration, getting information on migrant flows, and planning strategies to how to control Central American migration. When John Kelly, who became chief of staff under Trump, was head of U.S. Southern Command, his idea was that Central American migration needed to be controlled in Central America. And so Southern Command has been playing with strategies of how to control migration even within Central America. One strategy has been to develop task force, they call them border security task forces in Guatemala and in El Salvador to control or regulate the flows of people in Central America. And so the U.S. has provided training for these task forces. In Guatemala, there's a task force near the border with Mexico, and there's a task force near the border with Honduras, El Salvador, right? And so the training is provided by Texas National Guard, the U.S. Army, Border Patrol, et cetera, et cetera. Southern Command also has put a lot of money into security task forces in Central America, millions of dollars in Guatemala, and also money in for task forces in El Salvador. Officers involved in this planning are brought to San Antonio and Fort Sam Houston in training centers in Texas. So this is an ongoing process that we hear very little about, but it's part of a strategy of the U.S. on how to control Central American migration from a military perspective. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Next, we have Lacey Abrego.
I wonder if people want to ask just briefly.
Oh, yes.
A question for
Nestor?
Nestor, since he's going to be leaving us and we won't have a chance for Q&A. If anybody has a couple of questions, maybe we can take for him. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah,
Nestor?
please. Mm-hmm.
Comments, questions for Nestor? Yes, we have two. Marta and in the back.
Do you want to give her the mic?
Yes, yes.
Voy a hacer la pregunta en español porque no hablo en inglés, ¿verdad? Entonces, yo quería hacerle un comentario respecto al tema de la paridad del quetzal con el dólar, pero también del quetzal con el peso mexicano. Me llama la atención que la paridad del peso quetzal se convirtió en una atracción hacia del quetzal, el dólar, se convirtió en una atracción hacia Estados Unidos, pero en el caso mexicano se convirtió en retracción de la migración de trabajadores guatemaltecos a México. Y en realidad llegan a México porque tienen trabajo seguro, y lo pongo entre comillas, es decir, consiguen trabajo, pero los salarios se han precarizado o los ingresos se han precarizado. Y entonces es esta dualidad que veo yo del push-pull, en todo caso de la cotización o del peso, de la paridad del quetzal respecto al dólar y al peso, que está teniendo un efecto en una zona expulsa y en otra contrae. Es un comentario con relación a eso.
Sí, creo que es muy importante, como digo, entender, como usted dice, ¿no? Como el uso del quetzal, la moneda, ¿no? Puede variar en diferentes regiones. Yo sé que, bueno, yo estaba en Houston haciendo investigación sobre inmigración centroamericana, ¿no? Y muchas veces cuando los migrantes de Guatemala venían, traían quetzales para arreglar cuentas con la moneda del país de ellos, ¿no? Es decir, no nomás es el dólar que es importante, pero también entre los migrantes la moneda del país de ellos, el quetzal, el peso, etcétera, etcétera. Es decir, estas comunidades son muy transnacional o internacional y así como usan diferentes idiomas y lenguas también usan diferentes monedas de dinero de sus países, ¿no? Ujú.
Mr. Rodriguez, I would like to know if the conditions and the treatment by the United States is worse now than it was in the 1980s.
That's a very good question, and I'm trying to figure out how to compare because our expectations are greater now. For some reason, I think we expect more dignity and respect in the treatment of other people, right? But I can remember when there was a massive flow of Hondurans who came to the Mexican-Texas border, and there was a big flow that was kept back. The Red Cross came into the border area of Texas, and it opened up a tent city for the Hondurans. And the Border Patrol, under the old system of the INS, was determined not to let them leave the valley, or we call it the valley here, the border area. But eventually they did. I think that maybe because the numbers were smaller compared to today, but I think that there was a greater concern of dealing with immigrants a little bit better than we do today. I think today it's like under the present administration, like a total rejection of any idea of humanitarian reflections for the migrants. I think it seems like this administration is just an absolute rejection of the migrants who are trying to take advantage of legal means of entering this country.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, one more.
Yes, my question is in terms of the border security, how in your research, in your research, how has that shifted the dynamic of the lives of those who are living in those particular areas, specifically their mental health?
You mean like how compared to the 1980s, how has security affected the conditions of the migrants?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think one thing is that I think there seems to be a lot more fear and stress and concern of families, of not just the migrants, but their relatives in the U.S., even the U.S.-born children, the students in my classes, right, who want to write term papers on how hard it is for their families. So there's always been fear, I think, and concern for security of irregular migrants who are not afforded an ability to enter the country with authorization because they're outside the sanction of the state. But I think it's greater now, and I think because now the forces that regulate migration, now we have ICE. We didn't have ICE in the 1980s. We had Border Patrol and INS inspectors, but they were a very small number, less than 300 for the whole country, right? So now the technology of surveillance and control and regulation is much more. It's massive, and so it bears on communities and individuals, I think, like never before. And you can look at the data by the Pew Research Center. They do a question almost annually asking immigrants that they survey, how worried or how much fear do you have that you will be deported or that a family will be deported, a family member? And almost in the last 3 or 4 years or so, that the fear and worry of being deported among immigrants and their U.S.-born relatives has grown every year. So it's like we're living in it for many migrants. It's in an age of fear, but having years of experience with immigrant communities, I don't at all want to suggest that migrants cannot have a normal lives or normal moments, because I know that people in communities learn how to carve space and time to enjoy things that they can, however they can.
Any other questions or comments for Nestor? Okay, well, thank you so much, Nestor, for joining us, and we'll come back probably, hopefully later.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Lacey Abrego, who will.
Do I need to speak into that mic? For the
That mic,
folks,
right?
Should I use this one? Okay.
We are recording, so we are very conscientious about speaking into the mic.
So again, buenos dias, good morning. First, let me say that I apologize for hovering and texting up here. I was trying to manage Nestor. I'm not usually that rude. The other thing I want to say is that if you were here last night and you saw the film, Los Eternos Indocumentados, and now you've heard Nestor's presentation, it feels like I'm going to be saying a lot of what you've already heard, but we'll just keep the conversation going. This week marked a year since the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy, was started by the Trump administration, and there's been a lot of attention on this. As someone who is Salvadoran, born in El Salvador, grew up in LA, the fact that we are always on the news now still is shocking to me, right? Nobody knew who we were, and suddenly here we are, this huge crisis, and always on the news, and usually because of something horrible, right? Usually because we are suffering or criminally harming, or just some kind of crisis, and this, what we're living right now is just a continuation of these forms of harm, but also of these representations of who Central Americans are. In this picture, from NBC News a few days ago, it depicts Honduran asylum seekers who had been sent back to Mexico after trying to get to the United States to apply for asylum. And you see that people are in, makeshift encampments near various border cities, in this case in Matamoros. So this Migrant Protection Protocols program, which we have to be very clear is an unlawful program that goes against all international human rights for seeking asylum, for seeking refugee status. It's a new federal rule that's been in place since January 2019. Asylum applicants who before could turn themselves in at the border and then come through, usually into detention centers for some time, but to fight their case within the United States, now are returned to Mexico, where they have to wait for a decision from there. The hearings take place in what some call border tent courts, and Mexico has kind of vaguely offered or guaranteed safety for these people, but there are approximately 60,000 people, give or take 10,000, based on what sources you look at. And these people are in limbo. They're there, they reached almost into the United States to apply for asylum, and then now have to wait in these conditions that involve makeshift tents where they live with their children under freezing conditions during the winter, in many cases. As of just earlier this month, I think it was 816 public reports had been filed already that included murder, torture, rape, kidnapping, and other violent attacks against people who are in a part of this Remain in Mexico policy. So we know multiple people have died, including at least one child. We know that as they await for decisions on their cases, more than 19,000 have already been given removal orders. Another 9,000 had their proceedings terminated. We are waiting on nearly 30,000 cases that are still pending. Only 187 have been granted relief. So that is less than a 1% chance. It's like 0.003 chance of getting asylum through this process, right? And it's never, getting asylum is never a high likelihood. It's only about 20% in general. But you see that this is an impossible situation and it's putting people in danger. So I think this question that came up earlier about when was it worse, is it now or before, is probably the wrong question to ask, because it's always been horrible and it's always been harmful in perhaps different ways, targeting different communities in different moments. And I want to give you an example from 1985. Jenny Lisette Flores, who is the named plaintiff in the Flores settlement case, that continues to be the only standards that we have for how children are to be treated under U.S. custody, started because of thousands of Central American children who were detained in terrible conditions. In 1985, Jenny Lisette Flores came from El Salvador by herself to reunite with her mother, who was an undocumented domestic worker in Los Angeles, and she was detained in conditions that included being placed with unrelated adults, that included not having access to health care, being forcefully body searched often. And so thousands of Central American children joined this class action lawsuit that took 12 years of litigation from 1985 to 1997 to finally get us the Flores Settlement Agreement, which, if you're following, is still being contested right now because the Trump administration wants to end even those very minimal security programs and rights that children in detention have, as did the Obama administration before, and as people had to fight in the 80s just to set in place. So we have those standards, but what you hear about what's happening with MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, the situation was terrible to begin with. This is just an excerpt from the lawsuit that talks about what was going on in 1984, and the fact that, I won't read it all to you, but very clear that part of the process was that setting up these conditions for the children was unlawful, right? This practice of unlawfully changing the law to harm Central Americans is not new, right? It's been going on for the entire duration of Central American migration to the United States in mass numbers. So it is on the basis of working with Central American migrants that Cecilia Menjivar and I came up with this framework to understand migration. In sociology, the way that I was trained, we were supposed to look at whether migrants were successful based on how many had gone to college and how much money they make, and these how many have intermarried with whites, right? This was considered success. And so there was a real need to think about people like Lisette Flores, who, how do you measure success in that case, right? That she was able to get this lawsuit passed based on the suffering that she had lived through under a U.S. institution. And so legal violence is about capturing structural violence, what is done through systems in place that make it absolutely true that people will be harmed in the process, what happens within the labor market that is exploitative, what happens within a discriminatory educational system, right? The ways that systems are set up to ensure that some people will be on top and some people will not, right? Things that will mean that in this case, immigration policy does not benefit everyone equally. We have symbolic violence covered here as well, because what happens is you start to see these patterns, and rather than say, oh, that's because the system is doing this, people internalize what's going on and assume that it's just normal. What we're seeing is normal, that these people are being caged. That's their own fault because they must have done something that didn't, follow the law, right? We internalize it. We also blame the victims in the process. And often the victims blame themselves. So many interviews that I've done, people will say, I knew that this was a possibility. I was going to die, but I also, I took this risk, and they take responsibility or ownership over the suffering that they're living under these various conditions, right? So legal violence is about recognizing how those things play out and are enforced, are made possible through the legal system in such a way that violence results from and is made possible through the implementation of the law, right? Just implementing the law is going to lead to suffering. And then harming people becomes normal and it becomes acceptable. And perhaps right now under the Trump administration, there are more people paying attention and recognizing that MPP and everything else that is going on is wrong. But these things have been going on in previous administrations to some extent, and people were not as willing to really call it out because it's so much easier to turn a blind eye when, we have a really charismatic leader. So Central Americans, we were coming, as we mentioned, Cecilia mentioned earlier, since the turn of the last century, but in small numbers, right? And so what is it about, as you can see here, the 1980s when everything shifted? We heard from Nestor. He has a hypothesis, and perhaps it's not something that I've ever looked into, but I know that certainly there was a lot of death and torture and all sorts of things that forced people to leave in the 1980s that included a lot of U.S. foreign policy of funding, of training, of providing equipment to the military and paramilitary groups to harm entire groups of people. There was already a long history of U.S. intervention, economic, military intervention in the region. It's extremely fertile land, and I could show you various clips of Ronald Reagan talking about Central America and what it geopolitically means to this country. But also, during the Cold War, knowing that people were fighting to end the status quo against the capitalist system that was harming the vast majority of the people in each of these countries, the armed conflict then was the major way that the United States intervened. In Guatemala, they helped to fund genocide against mostly Mayan indigenous peoples in the country. 200,000 people were murdered, over 80% of them were Mayans. The U.S. funded the Guatemalan military police forces that committed 93% of the war crimes, as was determined by the UN Commission, the Truth Commission that did the work after the war. Similarly, next door in El Salvador, the U.S. funded the military and paramilitary to commit murder on there were at least 75,000 people who died during the war, and the UN Truth Commission in that case found that 85% of war atrocities were caused by the side that was funded and trained by the United States. And so this is largely what forced so many people to leave in that moment. If you looked in the United States, we were only being told that these are communists, that they're bringing anarchy, that they're subversives, and so that's the entire story that was relayed here. As someone, again, who is Salvadoran, who's grown up in this country, this narrative then determines how people see me, my family, and it's not only by a white U.S. public, but also from other Latinxes, people of color, right? Central Americans have this kind of, era of anarchy and of communism and problems, right? So that's all we get until, again, in 2014, when Central Americans start to be on the news again. And this time for the large numbers of unaccompanied minors who were coming. And certainly there was a big jump. We were taking note and actually documenting how many people were coming in, which hadn't always been the case. And we start to see these images of children, young mothers with children being detained in terrible conditions, and there was a little bit of an outcry, I would say, because again, we had a very charismatic leader in place, and Obama used this, really kind and warm sort of language to talk about, that there's criminality and there's violence that surrounds them when they come, and we don't want them to face that. And so we need to make sure that they understand that they shouldn't be coming because they're going to face that violence on their way up. And so what he did in that moment was to use that beautiful language to translate into an expansion of the U.S. border south into Mexico by funding securitization programs throughout the region, and then expanding the U.S. border lack of legal protections internally through an expansive network of detention centers, and all with this rhetoric of deterrence. We just want them to understand that they shouldn't be coming, and we don't want to encourage them to keep coming, so we need to maintain them in immigrant prisons. So we know that the U.S. gives assistance, right, to different countries. This is for Mexico, a report that was done in 2013 showing that the majority of funding to Mexico typically goes toward military and police assistance, right? And the assumption was that that was going to kind of lower, but then in 2014, as Central Americans start to come in, the Plan Frontera Sur, as we learned from Nestor, existed before, was implemented again, I guess. And really, the Obama administration was very open about saying this: we are extending our border south. They made these are the main routes that Central Americans take. They made those ever more dangerous. They were dangerous to begin with, but they made it so that the number of kidnappings, torture, rape, all of this increased and affected the numbers of detentions and deportations in Mexico, so that within a 3-year period, it doubled in size how many people were being deported from Mexico back to Central America, and the number of unaccompanied minors multiplied by 10 in a span of 3 years with this U.S. funding and this approach, right? Within the U.S., we saw, like I mentioned, the expansion of these detention centers within 6 months. In about May, June 2014, when we started to see those images, there was only one, what they called family residential center. And by December, that number of beds had multiplied 35 times over. So within a 6-month period, they used this Central American crisis to expand this. And just to be clear, these family residential centers are prisons, and activists and people who have been in them rightfully call them prisons or baby jails. Now, we hear a whole lot about the abuse that is happening with people at the border and detention centers all over right now, right? This also has been going on. This is from a report that the American Civil Liberties Union, and with collaboration with I believe it's a law school at the University of Chicago, they were able to, through a FOIA request, ask about abuses of minors by Border Patrol agents, and they received 30,000 pages documenting abuse of minors. And I won't read them. They're very painful to read, and these are not the most egregious cases. I just picked a few for you to know that this has been going on. This is not new under the Trump administration. Trump, who came in and in 2008 in particular really changed up policies as they affected Central American migrants, you see that the numbers were a lot less than what they were in 2014, but he still talked about Central American migrants as being a huge problem, even as president-elect. The first time he was asked about what his immigration policies would be, the journalist for Time mentions that in response to that question, he got up, he grabbed what was essentially a tabloid that had information about a violent attack that MS-13 gang members had done in New York, and he grabbed that. And again, in response to the question about immigration policy, he said, they come from Central America, they're tougher than any people you've ever met, they're killing and raping everybody out there, and they're illegal and they are finished. In his announcement of the immigration executive borders, one of the very first things he did as president, he also mentioned we're in the middle of a crisis on our southern border. The unprecedented surge of illegal migrants from Central America is harming both Mexico and the United States, right? At every turn, he, and we can look at thousands of tweets at this point, but always equating gangs, Central Americans, Salvadorans often in particular. Many of these gang members, he said in his first State of the Union address, took advantage of glaring loopholes in our laws to enter the country as illegal, unaccompanied alien minors, right? If you just hear that, it's really easy to forget that you're talking about human beings, right? Obama used children and, a kindness towards them that we would have expected. Trump just doesn't bother with that. So under Trump, this discourse, Central Americans are crisis in a much more direct way, national security, dehumanized criminals, they're an invasion. Even his wife, the First Lady, when she finally went to the detention centers, she wore this coat that on the back says, "I really don't care, do you?" Right? And she claims she didn't notice and whatever, but, so all of that, makes it then not that surprising that by May of 2018, it became official policy, the zero tolerance border policy, where every adult immigrant apprehended at the border was prosecuted through ICE. That was not the case necessarily if people were applying for asylum. Parents were separated from their children. Officially, about 2,700 families were separated, but we keep hearing every few months, oh yeah, that's still going on. We know of 600 more cases. We know of, right? In each case, the children were sent through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so the parents and the children are in different agencies, and there's no centralized system to keep track of how they were going to be reunited. And so some people had been separated for as I've heard very recently, up to 2 years now. We've seen pain and suffering of children, of parents deported without their children. And we know, we hear a lot less, but it's true that particularly teenagers from Central America continue to be detained in these tent cities, and it's important to keep track of all that. I've run out of time, and so I won't go into all of the details anymore because it sounds like a lot of us are going to be sharing these. But I just want to be very clear that in the representation of Central Americans, always as a crisis, either as criminals or as just victims, helpless victims, we always erase, at least in the main discourse, the role of the United States in creating all of this and maintaining it and reproducing it. And what's happening right now, I can guarantee you, will have effects for generations to come as people have to heal from the kind of legal violence that we're seeing. So I look forward to having, conversations around these topics, and I thank you all for being here.
Lacey, would you like to take a couple of questions, comments, or should we just do it at the end?
I think it's okay to have Amarela go since
Okay.
we're both going to be here.
Okay. All right. So next we have Amarela Varela from the Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de México, who will give us a similar overview of on the Mexican side. And I think we from Nestor's and Lacey's presentation, we now have a notion of how what David Fitzgerald has called in his recent book, systems of remote control, have worked so much that the U.S. border has not only expanded beyond the territorial border, but has made Mexico in its entirety become a vertical border. This is what he argues in his book, and I think we can see how that has happened through systems of control throughout Mexico. And so, Amarela.
Bueno, pues primero que nada voy a hablar en castellano. Hice las láminas en inglés para hacer un ejercicio falso de bilingüismo, pero no soy bilingüe. I'm sorry for this. Y prefiero hablar en mi lengua materna. Quiero decir 3 cosas muy importantes. Me siento muy conmovida de hablar entre ustedes porque es la primera vez que comparto estas reflexiones con un público hijo de la diáspora de América Central, que para mí son la fuente fundamental de información con la que he conseguido decolonizar mi pensamiento sobre ustedes. Entonces, pues estoy muy nerviosa porque siempre siento que le hablo a gente que no compartió la experiencia de las masacres, de las guerras, pero también de la apuesta por la liberación nacional. Entonces, pues me da mucha emoción compartir con ustedes. Yo de pequeña en mi casa recibimos a familias de centroamericanas y centroamericanos, sobre todo de nicaragüenses y salvadoreñas, que tomaban treguas de la guerra. Yo que esa fue mi infancia, mi casa fue una especie de casa refugio y pues me da muchísima emoción encontrarme el día de hoy con ustedes. Y la segunda es que están aquí, lo que voy a contar está un poco enmarcado en mi experiencia de trabajo como habitando el privilegio epistemológico de vivir un cuerpo racializado en Europa. Estuve 10 años en Barcelona y fui confundida con ecuatoriana en la calle y con latinoamericana en las aulas, porque no llevaba una formación latinoamericanista. Fue al enfrentarme a ese racismo epistemológico que me tuve que formar. Y lo que Lacey nos acaba de presentar sucedió de una manera similar en la década de los 90s y los 2000s, cuando yo trabajé con magrebíes y pakistaníes. Me parece muy importante que partamos de la certeza de que es una guerra global y total y que no le demos los créditos a las administraciones republicanas o demócratas de Morena o del PRI, de estas políticas que son globales, porque estas políticas de externalización de fronteras, de securitización de fronteras, de criminalización del otro radical, son globales y asisten, digamos, se derivan de toda una tecnocracia, por cierto, muy bien formada en el derecho humanismo, y tiene paralelismos, pues, ¿no? Entonces, pues, me parece importante decir esto, pero también me siento, pues, me parece muy distópica esta conferencia, y me parecen muy distópicos nuestros temas, porque les voy a hablar o sea, a ustedes qué les voy a decir, ¿no? Pero es muy distópico hablar en México de la política de tapón, ¿no? De las políticas de muerte, porque ahí también es como hablarle a un auditorio que no es que hayan crecido en las certezas. Todos mis estudiantes que están en el aula, en la universidad que yo trabajo, han llegado al aula porque sus papás están aquí, trabajando clandestinizados en las sombras, Mi universidad es posible porque vivimos de las remesas de los trabajadores que viven aquí ilegalizados por la ley, ¿no? Que viven una hiperexplotación laboral y una guerra total contra su alteridad. Pero pues tengo que explicar esto que somos un país tapón. Es lo mismo que le pasaba a mis amigas turcas cuando regresaban a Turquía a explicar lo que Europa les obligaba a hacer con sus hermanos del Medio Oriente, ¿no? Entonces, pues para empezar me parece importante eso, situar mi conocimiento diciendo que me parece muy distópica esta conversación. O sea, me parece de un tiempo muy distópico, ¿no? Bueno, y a mí me encargaron compartirles cómo estamos haciendo el trabajo, cómo se traduce los costos humanos, la traducción a costos humanos de la externalización y la securitización como tendencia global del gobierno global de las migraciones, pero concretamente cómo es que Estados Unidos, digamos, los gobiernos, las administraciones han hecho del muro que divide Tijuana de San Diego y toda la franja una especie de liga para jalarlo primero al Suchiate y ahora ya hasta Honduras mismo, ¿no? Como la externalización de las fronteras. Entonces les voy a hablar en concreto de esta población con la que ahora mucha gente en México venimos trabajando de una manera distópica también, ¿no? Porque la trabajamos a través del Pew Research Center y no a través de la inteligencia centroamericana. Es muy difícil encontrar, a menos de que te vayas a hacer estancias a Honduras, a Guatemala, a El Salvador y converses en cafés, a intelectuales centroamericanos, en México me refiero, pensando la fuga de su población, ¿no? Bueno, empezaré diciendo que sí, este es un discurso así muy macro, ¿no? Y yo dividiría el discurso oficial, porque si fuiste guatemalteco en los 90 en México no era un santuario, ¿no? Probablemente si fuiste español durante la posguerra o la dictadura, o si fuiste argentino durante la dictadura y fuiste a México por tu cuerpo racializado como blanco, sí puedes haberlo vivido como un santuario, pero si eras indio de Guatemala, es otro discurso. Pero bueno, el gobierno, creo que el imaginario colectivo es que México fue un país santuario que recibió al exilio entre 1940 y 1990. Aunque nunca, digamos, no ha habido, bueno, los historiadores sí, bueno, esa es la tercera cosa que me falta, que aquí están mis profesores, y también por eso estoy nerviosa, porque es la gente con la que yo he aprendido a entender las migraciones internacionales. El discurso sobre el exilio, el discurso sobre la militarización actual, la guerra total contra los migrantes, carece de un discurso publicado como política pública. Lo rastreamos a través de instrumentos sociodemográficos, hasta constitucionales, pero no, como tal no tenemos una política migratoria, ¿no? No es una retórica que hasta esta época se empieza a instalar. Después, entre 1990 y 2010, que no me voy a detener porque creo que Lacey, eso es lo que digo, que en México, pues si se olvida, en México sucedió lo mismo que en América Central, hubo una apuesta por la liberación nacional y también hubo una guerra sucia y hay un número indecible porque no sabemos cuántos son de desaparecidos políticos. Hubo masacres, ¿no? Hubo y hay, pero no se enseña en las aulas. Así que si no se enseñan nuestras propias contrainsurgencias, la verdad es que en los ejercicios que yo hago con mis estudiantes no saben dónde queda, digamos, San Pedro Sula, no saben qué es América Central, mucho menos saben de sus apuestas por la liberación nacional y luego del discurso y de la retórica de la prosperidad para el reacomodo, ¿no? Entonces, hay una especie de amnesia histórica y ahí es donde transitamos a esto que explicó y bueno, que les van a explicar aquí los profesores que rastrean desde un discurso más sociodemográfico, más pues estadístico, pero también de las digamos, desde la ciencia política, se construye de nosotros lo que los migrantes, me parece muy importante decir, la noción de país frontera o de frontera vertical la inventaron los migrantes centroamericanos, que tenían que pasar por una suma de checkpoints legales con agentes de migración, pero paralegales también. Y lo paralegal va desde el cobro del uso del baño en Tijuana por $20 cuando no cuesta nada, ¿no? O hasta el secuestro, la violación, la extorsión, que se mueve también, digamos, como los crímenes de Estado, lo que nos hablaste de la contrainsurgencia en América Central, hasta ahora, ahora no está operante porque la acaban de neutralizar con una suma de conflictos del partido en el poder, pero la Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos ha documentado históricamente que 8 de cada 10 delitos contra migrantes se cometen en colusión con agentes estatales. Es decir, así como dicen los papás de los compañeros de Ayotzinapa desaparecidos, es el Estado el que comete la violencia paralegal. Y por eso nos dicen frontera vertical, hasta convertirnos, no sé si está bien la traducción, en un país tapón. Yo creo que la mejor, y que es, digamos, de la época de Trump, desde que empieza la época de Trump, pero también desde que en el Mediterráneo se vuelve ilegal rescatar a náufragos y se encierra a los navegantes y las navegantes que rescatan náufragos. Es una cuestión global, ¿sí? No es nada más la relación México-Estados Unidos, o desde que en Ecuador se mueren niños escondidos en donde se lleva el equipaje de los aviones, intentando alcanzar a sus papás aquí. Esa es la época de México, un país tapón donde es muy difícil entrar, y si entras, como decimos nosotros y con todo respeto, ya te chingaste, porque no vas a poder salir. Somos un cuello de botella en el que te vas a quedar atrapado, y por eso Carmen Fernández propone la categoría, que nos va a exponer al rato, de transitoriedad permanente. Se quedan en el limbo jurídico atrapados, ¿no? Y esa es la época que estábamos viviendo. Pero también por eso les digo que es muy distópico. Creo que es muy importante que recordemos como comunidades que somos mesoamericanas, que además de un país tapón, México es un país de expulsión, ¿no? Ya nos van a exponer al rato cómo es una fantasía eso de la tasa cero de la migración centroamericana. Es un país de tránsito, es una frontera vertical, es un país de instalación, no nada más para centroamericanos. Es un país de retorno forzado, de deportación. Han habido 3 millones de deportados, los que llevamos contabilizados. Pero además es un país donde está sucediendo una guerra no declarada, y que no es una guerra, de ahí la dificultad para catalogarla, porque no somos nosotras contra el Estado, es el Estado contra todas nosotras. Nosotras no estamos armadas, no tenemos, digamos, un discurso antagónico o caníbal en contra del Estado, y ellos sí tienen prácticas contra nosotras y nosotros como un Estado, como una situación de guerra. Pero no es una guerra, porque no son dos bandos, ¿no? No estamos armados los dos bandos. Pero entonces hasta el año pasado se tenían contabilizados 500,000 de desplazados internos. Somos una mezcla de Turquía con Colombia, ¿no? Y al mismo tiempo, como sucede aquí, se construye, que yo creo que es sumamente distópico, porque en el tiempo en el que yo vivía en España, digamos, los vascos son muy diferentes a los senegaleses, ¿no? Pero yo no soy muy distinta a ustedes. Somos mestizas, atravesadas por una suma de raíces mayas o aztecas o mazatecas, para no ser aztecocéntrica, como ya lo sufrieron sus papás. O sea, somos las mismas, ¿no? Hay muchas de las estrategias de camuflaje para atravesar México, la frontera vertical. Te cotorrean los migrantes y te dicen: fui al centro de la Ciudad de México y me compré la misma muda del compañero. Y me compré una laptop. y pasé en los autobuses camuflado de estudiante que iba de Chiapas, de haber visto a su familia a Tijuana a estudiar, porque somos iguales, ¿no? Pero hay una retórica que opera desde la antropología, desde la psicología, desde la academia, que les digo que dialogamos poco con América Central, y si lo hacemos a través de la literatura norteamericana, que les voy a decir a ustedes, ¿quién tiene ahí la hegemonía de la palabra? Ustedes no, nosotros tampoco, ¿no? Entonces, hay una producción del ellos caníbales, nosotros no sé qué, ¿no? Porque tenemos unas cifras de desapariciones, de feminicidios, de infanticidios, de impunidad, que es igual que los barómetros con el que nos miden biopolíticamente los Pew Centers del mundo, a los de América Central, ¿no? Pero se está produciendo una narrativa de ellos no somos nosotros. Y como no somos nosotros, es posible no solamente que los violente el Estado, sino como decían, digamos, los clásicos, hay un racismo institucional porque hay un racismo social que lo permite, pero entre iguales. Cosa que no es nada nueva también, ustedes viniendo de la diáspora, que vienen nosotros que somos 56 pueblos y nos creemos todos la raza de bronce, los mexicanos somos 56 pueblos más los criollos, ¿no? Y en contra de eso hay unas voces pequeñitas que no tienen mucho. Hay estudiantes de América Central en México porque están estudiando, se quedaron ahí atrapados. Hay voces críticas de los medios, de la academia, que dicen que compartimos muchas prácticas de vida, compartimos las mismas luchas de tramas comunitarias, compartimos las mismas diásporas, o sea, somos también, 1 de cada 10 de nosotros está aquí. Y se producen muchas complicidades narrativas y en la práctica las luchas se tocan, ¿no? Pero también compartimos muchas prácticas de muerte en Mesoamérica, contrainsurgencia, masacres, impunidad, racismo, clasismo, sexismo, una política de criminalizar y asesinar a líderes sociales, y compartimos el mismo modelo de prosperidad del TLC, un modelo de neoliberalismo basado en el extractivismo, en la maquila, pero también en esas economías paralegales que se le escapan a los barómetros estatales. Compartimos las mismas formas de economía ilegal y paralegal. Y por eso no me refiero nada más a la fantasía, al relato de la narcopolítica creado en torno a nosotros como región 4. No nada más es paralegal el narco, también hay una paralegalidad en torno, por ejemplo, a todo el comercio informal, como el de aquí del barrio de César Chávez, que está, digamos, hay mucha gente en la calle como evadiendo los mercados formales porque no tiene de otra, ¿no? Vendiendo cosas, la mayoría de los dineros en México se mueven por lo que llamamos el monedeo, el mercado informal de trabajo. Por eso, por ejemplo, cuando declaran crisis de salud, es tremendo, porque si nos recluyen a las casas, la gente no sale a la calle a trabajar, y la calle es el principal espacio público de trabajo, además de las maquilas. Compartimos también los motivos del éxodo que trajeron a sus papás hasta acá, a los que vinieron por razones económicas y también a los que vinieron por razones políticas. Estas son 2 fotos de mexicanos, me parece importante decir. La primera es de un niño jornalero en el norte de México que fue enganchado desde Chiapas, y la segunda es de la semana pasada, de unos niños que están siendo entrenados por sus papás de una organización. Es muy difícil de explicar y no me da tiempo, pero que son grupos, son pueblos indios que se armaron para defenderse de una suma de criminalidades, entre ellas el Estado, y hoy están teniendo que entrenar a sus hijos. No son niños soldados, son niños, es muy complejo, pero se parecen a las fotos que hemos estado viendo de ayer, que hablaron los migrantes a través de la voz fílmica, y de hoy con Lacey, ¿no? Y voy a irme un poco más rápido para explicar cuál es la traducción concreta. Nosotras, con el dinero de las remesas, porque esa es la primera fuente del Producto Interno Bruto mexicano, está ya incluso por arriba del petróleo, estamos deportando a 9 de cada 10 intentos, que no son personas, porque es otra discusión que tenemos. Ni siquiera nos hemos puesto de acuerdo en cómo contar el desastre. No solo no sabemos cuántos muertos migrantes hay, no sabemos bien a bien cuántos migrantes vivos lo intentan cada año. Y entonces nos hemos puesto de acuerdo en un punto intermedio y contamos a través de intentos de cruce, ¿no? Yo tengo una amiga que ha intentado cruzar 17 veces. Bueno, estamos deteniendo 9 de cada 10 intentos. Y eso es posible, que yo creo que ahí también se parece y que hay que empezar a decirlo con medidas legales, paralegales y alegales, ¿no? Hay un estado de excepción permanente en torno al tratamiento de la migración en México y al mismo tiempo hay una retórica: a los migrantes no se les detiene, se les resguarda, a los migrantes no se les deporta, se les retorna, ¿sí? Hay una retórica derecho humanista y cuando decimos esto en México, toda la tecnocracia, hay ejércitos de jovencitos especialistas en la política migratoria, formados en institutos europeos que intentan la fantasía de gobernar la migración, porque es una fantasía necropolítica, nunca se ha podido gobernar. Cuando tú dices esto en México, los compas tecnócratas se ponen así, porque dices, bueno, y me parece grave, no es una broma, me parece grave que hoy incluso ni siquiera recurran al derecho humanismo y nos basuricen, ¿no? O sea, que Trump diga que no somos humanos. Pero también creo que hay que hacer una crítica a la tecnocracia derecho humanista que sigue pegada, aferrada a la fantasía de que puede haber una migración legal, ordenada y segura. Eso no quiere decir que sea el deseo de todas nosotras, o sea, no queremos... Yo sí soy desde anarquista hasta comunista y ahora feminista, pero no quiere decir, no es un discurso ideológico, ¿no? No es que estemos diciendo políticas de puertas abiertas total, porque sería neoliberalismo total también, ¿no? Estamos reclamando a los estados la protección, ¿no? Pero no a través de esas retóricas de gobernanza que son pura hipocresía, ¿no? Porque producen ilegalidad. Ya no les voy a poner 2 videos, pero sé porque no me da tiempo y me voy a comer el tiempo de los demás, pero quería traer con este juego que estoy haciendo de prácticas de muerte contra prácticas de vida, lo que pasó con los caravaneros. ¿Cómo voy de tiempo? Ya se me acabó, ¿no? Les voy a poner tantito para que los veamos, porque además también... Ya ven que como les conté que yo fui migrante, es muy común en los foros académicos mexicanos que todos hablamos sobre los migrantes y los migrantes no están, ¿no? Entonces, los compañeros tienen los sin papeles en Europa tienen una frase que dice: nunca más un discurso sobre nosotros sin nosotros, ¿no? Entonces, son ellos, a ver qué.
¡No les tengan miedo, pase!
Uy, no se ve. ¿Cómo lo puedo...? No se puede. Bueno, luego se los paso porque si no me voy a comer el tiempo. Es que se ve aquí, pero no se ve allí. No es de 1 minuto, pero por eso se los paso después. Y seguimos mejor porque me falta como varias láminas. Pero les traía un poco el discurso de los caravaneros, las imágenes de las familias centroamericanas, porque lo que yo digo es que lo que pasó en México con las caravanas, ahora ya sí voy a necesitar que me ayuden porque ya me descentré del PowerPoint, acá está. Sí, lo que pasó en México con las caravanas, bueno, estos son los costos humanos, pero les voy a decir que estas cifras, también tenemos el conflicto de que no sabemos en realidad. Y entonces a veces hemos replicado de una manera... O sea, estas cifras son del movimiento migrante mesoamericano, de este colectivo de madres que cada año sube a buscar a sus hijos desaparecidos en México, pero no está basado en nada sociocientífico, ni siquiera en cruce de datos, es producto de un seguimiento hemerográfico. Entonces, a veces lo que hacemos los académicos, yo se los presento porque es lo que tenemos, pero a veces lo que hacemos los académicos ante la falta de datos o de la rigurosidad para construirlos, es replicar como una narrativa porno-necropolítica que ahora está muy de moda en México, ¿no? Como vivimos en estrés postraumático permanente, vivimos de fake news, esto es aproximativo, ¿sí? Pero también definitivamente los migrantes ante estos costos humanos que son aproximativos pero son reales porque se traducen en que tu tío no llegó, pues se han empezado a quedar, y aquí no me voy a detener porque Carmen Fernández es la persona que me lo explicó, en México, ¿no? Se están quedando en México, pero México no tiene, o sea, si no tiene una política migratoria, mucho menos tenemos una política de acogida. No tenemos instrumentos o voluntad política para debatirla. E instituciones también, yo creo que los profesores les van a explicar el desastre de falta de voluntades, porque hay gente muy capaz en el gobierno federal y con voluntad de que funcione, pero hay muy poco presupuesto. Por ejemplo, se prioriza presupuestar la lógica de militarización de las fronteras y se le da poco a la Comisión Mexicana de Ayuda al Refugiado. Se le dan pocos fondos. Es muy dispar, ¿no? Ante esta situación, además de los centroamericanos, en el 2016 se ensayó también una narrativa en clave de crisis, que fueron cuando los haitianos vinieron desde Brasil y desde Venezuela, que vinieron a intentar pedir asilo a la frontera con Estados Unidos. Esta es nuestra propia crisis de refugiados en 2016, pero no me voy a detener porque aquí Dolores Dolores París es quien lo ha estudiado. Y también nos hemos convertido en un país donde los y las centroamericanas están pidiendo asilo, pero no solo no se concede, sino que es imposible aplicar a él. En muchas ocasiones las centroamericanas dicen no hay oficiales, y ahora en la última caravana ya no me da tiempo de contarlo, pero incluso se le mintió al contingente diciendo que sí iban a poder aplicar y no había agentes suficientes para recoger la solicitud. Es un desastre, ¿no? Bueno, y así como ni Trump es el primero, López Obrador hereda, que es López Obrador, ustedes sabrán, yo lo digo con muchísima tristeza, es como el tiempo de Funes. Peleamos un montón para que nuestro voto fuera respetado, votamos contra la guerra y hay un Funes en México. No les voy a explicar lo que nuestro corazón siente en términos de cómo está apachurrado por lo que está haciendo, ¿no? Bueno, hay una militarización del gobierno de la migración en México. Pasamos de su policialización a su militarización. Hay separación de familia. Esta es una foto de un centro de deportación al lado de mi universidad, de un centro de detención que está en Iztapalapa. En donde murió una niña el año pasado. Uno de los funcionarios de alto nivel dice que porque se cayó de la cama, y otro funcionario de migración dice que es porque estaba enferma de gripe. Y cuando intentamos investigarlo nos dijeron que esa misma noche habían deportado a la madre con la niña a Guatemala. Eso supera, yo creo, el régimen necropolítico de Estados Unidos. No sé, y a mí también, como a ti, Lacey, me parece como muy distópico preguntarnos qué es peor, qué es más cruel o qué no es más cruel. Yo a veces en los foros de académicos de la migración o con funcionarios que estamos discutiendo me imagino, y perdón por el paralelismo, pero sí me parece importante decirlo delante de ustedes porque es como si en Auschwitz estuvieran debatiendo, ¿es importante darles un jabón más o mejor darles 2 jabones más? No, es que Auschwitz no debió haber existido, ¿no? Y estamos discutiendo cómo humanitarizar la detención. Bueno, en México también, pero a diferencia de los instrumentos de información pública de este lado, allá, por ejemplo, se le acaba de prohibir el acceso a estaciones migratorias a las organizaciones, ya se les volvió a dar, pero es todo así, ¿no? Es como muy tropical, la verdad. Y hay 60,000 familias en la franja fronteriza, tampoco me voy a detener en ello. Se intentó hasta hace poco esta retórica también de cooperación al desarrollo para frenar, y se intentaba poner una cortina de contención laboral, ya está, para frenar la migración, producir un confín migratorio, que se quedaran los centroamericanos en el sureste de México haciendo el trabajo para la prosperidad. Yo siempre que, como deprimo en mucho mis exposiciones, quiero terminar con esto. Yo creo que, ¿qué podemos hacer nosotras y nosotros? Pues activismo epistemológico, leernos, decolonizar nuestro conocimiento y sobre todo como politizar la discusión, salir del closet, sacar nuestros saberes para que no solamente los funcionarios, sino las poblaciones sepan que, como dicen los compañeros zapatistas, nunca más un mundo sin nosotros, ¿no? Muchísimas gracias por escucharme.
Muchísimas gracias. Que se queden allá ustedes. Amarela. Muchísimas gracias, Amarela. Questions, comments for the two presentations. We have time for maybe 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes. So, questions, comments? We can have conversation. Yes.
Oh, there's someone back there.
Where? Okay, I'll be back. Miriam.
Este es un comentario y también una pregunta para Varela. En cuanto a lo que estaba mencionando del crimen organizado en México, hay dos guerras. Una guerra también no declarada contra el crimen organizado que ha creado inseguridad en México, en la que tanto ha expulsado migrantes mexicanos como ha victimizado a migrantes centroamericanos. Y solo quería preguntar, ¿qué se ha hecho al respecto durante esos 12 años de guerra, donde todos los migrantes, tanto mexicanos y como centroamericanos, han sido víctimas de una red criminal, especialmente en la frontera México-Estados Unidos? Y ¿qué pólizas hay o se han implementado para incrementar tal vez la seguridad no solamente del país, pero de los migrantes?
Sí, no, la guerra contra el narco sí está oficialmente declarada. Ahí sí, para que veas, hay todo una suma de documentos, hay reformas a la Constitución, hay una recién creada Guardia Nacional, pero antes se han intentado otras formas de cuerpos policiales. Y el tema es que esta guerra securitaria incluye la idea de que el tráfico de personas, que puede ser desde el coyote que te acompaña desde tu comunidad hasta los zetas que tienen grandes redes de trata de personas, es lo mismo para la ley. O sea, no hay una diferencia, ¿no? Entonces se ha hipercriminalizado legalmente la trata y tráfico, porque luego no hay, en México hay una tasa de impunidad del 99% según, digamos, organismos civiles, ¿no? Entonces, de los pocos casos que se denuncian, hay pocas sentencias, ¿no? Entonces, no hay, mi respuesta, a ver si los profesores que son más leídos tienen otras respuestas para ti, pero mi respuesta es que no hay una comprensión compleja del fenómeno, porque no hay cifras, porque ni siquiera nos hemos puesto de acuerdo en cómo contarlos. Y como no hay diagnóstico, no hay propuesta, digamos, estatal, porque si hay una suma de propuestas, te voy a poner un ejemplo. Un funcionario de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos que representaba a México le dijo al gobierno mexicano que podía, por ejemplo, meter filtros para el envío de dinero, porque ya ves que secuestran a nuestros familiares en Arriaga y resulta que hay un Oxxo que en Arriaga hay un, no sé, como aquí un 7-Eleven, una tiendita, ¿no? Que mueve más dinero que el banco de todo un barrio. Es evidente que se están pagando rescates. No sé, o sea, está buena la idea, me refiero. No es que falten ideas, pero no se ponen en práctica, ¿no?
And we have another question.
This is for Ms. Labrego. Even under the Obama administration, you said he used kind language. So does that mean that his policy was pretty much the same as the current policy towards immigrants?
It means that the language he used was not evident in the policies that were taking place against migrants, and that I don't know that you can say the same, right? He didn't have MPP in place. He didn't have, very particular things in place, but he helped to establish that network of detention centers in such a way that for the Trump administration to come in and take advantage of that and push it even further was a possibility.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? I just wanted to just make one point when we talk about the leaders who make decisions. We have to remember that it's not only the individual, but it is a network of advisors, of people working together, representing government, states. And so we have to always think of not individualizing so much, because then we attribute everything to one single president, one single person, and these are politics and policies that are created by a network of people who then continue from one administration to the other.